The Pacific Ocean stretched endlessly before Admiral William Frederick Bull Halsey, Jr. as he stood on the bridge of the USS New Jersey, his weathered hands gripping the rail with white knuckles. It was October 23, 1944, and the largest naval battle in human history was about to unfold in the waters surrounding the Philippine archipelago. The morning sun cast long shadows across the deck as intelligence reports flooded in. The Imperial Japanese Navy was making its final, desperate gambit to turn the tide of World War II. 3 years had passed since Pearl Harbor transformed America from a reluctant observer into a vengeful participant in the global conflict. Now, as General Douglas MacArthur prepared to fulfill his famous promise to return to the Philippines, the Japanese Empire faced an impossible choice: allow the Americans to establish an unbreakable foothold in their defensive perimeter, or commit their remaining naval forces to one last, all-or-nothing battle that could either save their empire or destroy it completely. Admiral Soemu Toyoda, Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet, had devised Operation Shogo-1, a complex plan that would divide the Japanese fleet into four distinct forces. The Northern Force, commanded by Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa, would serve as bait, using the remaining aircraft carriers now nearly empty of planes and experienced pilots to lure Halsey's powerful Third Fleet away from the main invasion beaches. Meanwhile, the Center Force under Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita would thread the needle through the dangerous waters of the San Bernardino Strait, emerging to devastate the vulnerable American transports and landing craft supporting MacArthur's invasion of Leyte. The Southern Force, split into two groups under Vice Admiral Shoji Nishimura and Kiyohide Shima, would simultaneously push through Surigao Strait to attack the invasion forces from the south. It was an audacious plan that required perfect timing, complete surprise, and more than a little luck, commodities that had become increasingly scarce for the Japanese as the war ground on into its fourth year. According to the Naval History and Heritage Command's official records, the Japanese committed virtually every remaining major warship to this operation, including the massive battleships Yamato and Musashi. On the American side, the invasion of Leyte represented more than just another step up the island-hopping campaign toward Japan itself. For MacArthur, it was personally a chance to redeem the humiliation of his retreat from the Philippines. In 1942, for the Navy, it was an opportunity to demonstrate the overwhelming industrial and technological superiority that American shipyards and factories had achieved after 3 years of total war mobilization. The American forces were truly staggering in their scope and power. Halsey's Third Fleet boasted 8 fleet carriers, 8 light carriers, 6 battleships, and dozens of cruisers and destroyers. Vice Admiral Thomas Casson Kincaid's 7th Fleet added 6 older battleships, 18 escort carriers, and hundreds of smaller vessels dedicated to supporting the amphibious landings. Together, they represented the largest concentration of naval power ever assembled under one flag. As dawn broke over the Philippine Sea on October 23rd, reconnaissance aircraft from both sides crisscrossed the vast expanse of ocean, searching for the enemy. The stage was set for a confrontation that would involve over 200 ships, nearly 2,000 aircraft, and more than 200,000 sailors, marines, and soldiers. The Battle of Leyte Gulf was about to begin, and when the smoke cleared for days later, the naval balance of power in the Pacific would be forever altered. The battle's opening act began not with the thunder of naval guns, but with the silent approach of American submarines prowling the depths of the Palawan Passage. At 0-6-30 hours on October 23rd, Commander David McClintock aboard the USS Darter spotted the distinctive silhouettes of Japanese heavy cruisers cutting through the pre-dawn darkness. The Center Force, Admiral Kurita's most powerful striking arm, had been discovered before it could achieve the surprise that was crucial to Operation Shogo-1's success. McClintock's urgent contact report crackled across the radio waves to Admiral Halsey's flagship. But the submarine commander wasn't finished. Working in coordination with the USS Dace under Commander Bladen Claggett, the two submarines maneuvered into perfect attack positions. As the Japanese column steamed unknowingly toward their doom, the heavy cruisers Otago and Maya, proud veterans of numerous Pacific battles, became sitting targets in the submarine's periscopes. At 0-6-30-2, the Darter's torpedoes found their mark. The Otago, Admiral Kurita's flagship, shuddered under multiple impacts as her magazines detonated in spectacular fashion. The explosion was so violent that Kurita himself was thrown into the oil-slick waters, forced to swim for his life as his command ship disappeared beneath the waves in less than 20 minutes. Simultaneously, the Dace's attack devastated the Maya, breaking her back and sending her to join her sister ship on the ocean floor. The loss of 2 heavy cruisers and his flagship in the opening moments of the battle was a catastrophic blow to Kurita's confidence and communications capabilities. As he was pulled from the water by a destroyer, the admiral found himself cut off from higher command and forced to transfer his flag to the mighty battleship Yamato. The element of surprise, so crucial to Japanese plans, had evaporated with the morning mist. Word of the submarine attacks reached Admiral Halsey within hours, confirming that the Japanese were indeed committing major forces to what promised to be the decisive naval battle of the Pacific War. The American admiral, his aggressive instincts roused by the prospect of destroying the remnants of the Imperial Navy, began positioning his forces for the killing blow. The Third Fleet's fast carriers launched search planes to track Kurita's movements, while preparing massive airstrikes to whittle down the Japanese before any surface engagement could occur. Meanwhile, in the southern approaches to Leyte Gulf, Admiral Jesse Oldendorf was methodically positioning his force of 6 battleships across the mouth of Surigao Strait. 5 of these vessels, West Virginia, Maryland, Mississippi, Tennessee, and California, were Pearl Harbor veterans, raised from the mud of that date, which will live in infamy, and rebuilt with the latest radar and fire control systems. The Pennsylvania, the 6th battleship, had been in dry dock during the Pearl Harbor attack, but bore her own scars from 3 years of Pacific combat. Oldendorf's battle plan was a masterpiece of naval tactical thinking, combining the lessons learned from 2 years of night fighting in the Solomon Islands with the devastating firepower of America's industrial resurgence. His destroyers and PT boats would harass the approaching Japanese with torpedo attacks, disrupting their formation and forcing them to run a gauntlet of increasingly heavy fire. As they advanced up the strait, the climax would come when his battleships crossed the Japanese T, bringing their full broadside armament to bear while the enemy could only reply with their forward guns. As October 23rd drew to a close, 3 separate Japanese forces were converging on Leyte Gulf through different approaches, while American forces prepared to meet them. With overwhelming firepower and tactical superiority, the greatest naval battle in history was entering its crucial phase, with the fate of the Philippines and perhaps the entire Pacific War hanging in the balance. October 24th dawned gray and overcast, the weather matching the grim mood aboard Admiral Kurita's remaining ships as they pressed eastward. Through the Sibian Sea, the center force had already been bloodied by submarine attacks, but the worst was yet to come. High above the cloud cover, search planes from Halsey's carriers were tracking every movement, vectoring in strike after strike of Hellcat fighters, Helldiver dive bombers, and Avenger torpedo planes. The morning's first air attacks focused on the massive battleship Musashi, sister ship to the legendary Yamato and pride of the Imperial Navy. Built in absolute secrecy and armed with 9 18-inch guns, the largest naval rifles ever mounted on a warship, she was theoretically unsinkable. But theory had little relevance when faced with the reality of coordinated air attacks by experienced American pilots flying superior aircraft. Wave after wave of carrier planes swooped down on the giant battleship, their bombs and torpedoes finding gaps in her armor and overwhelming her damage control capabilities. By noon, the Musashi had absorbed an incredible punishment: 17 bomb hits and 19 torpedo strikes that would have sunk any lesser vessel multiple times over. Her massive hull, designed to withstand the heaviest naval gunfire, proved vulnerable to the sustained air assault that represented the new reality of Pacific naval warfare. As the Musashi began her death agonies, listing heavily to port with her forward magazines flooded and her speed reduced to barely 10 knots, Admiral Kurita faced an agonizing decision. His force had been under constant air attack for over 6 hours, expending precious anti-aircraft ammunition while suffering mounting casualties. The heavy cruiser Myoko had been crippled and forced to retire, while numerous other vessels bore the scars of near misses and direct hits. Naval historian Samuel Eliot Morrison later wrote in his authoritative 15-volume history of U.S. naval operations in World War II that the air attacks on October 24th represented the most concentrated and sustained carrier-based assault ever mounted against a surface fleet. At 15:30 hours, Kurita made the decision that would later subject him to fierce criticism from Japanese naval historians. He ordered the center force to reverse course and withdraw westward, apparently abandoning Operation Shogo I just as it reached its critical phase. From the American perspective, this appeared to be a complete victory. House's airmen had turned back the most dangerous Japanese thrust without risking a single surface ship. But even as Kurita's apparent retreat was being reported to American commanders, Admiral Ozawa's northern force was achieving its primary objective. The Japanese bait force had been spotted by American reconnaissance at 1440 hours, revealing for aircraft carriers escorted by battleships and cruisers approximately 300 miles northeast of Luzon. To Halsey, this represented the ultimate prize, a chance to destroy the remaining Japanese carrier force and eliminate the enemy's ability to project air power across the Pacific. The sight of enemy carriers triggered an almost Pavlovian response in the aggressive American admiral. Throughout the Pacific War, carriers had proven to be the decisive weapon, and Halsey's entire tactical philosophy centered on their destruction. Despite lacking significant air groups, most of Ozawa's planes had been expended in earlier battles or transferred to land bases. The Japanese carriers still represented a strategic threat that demanded immediate attention. As afternoon turned to evening, Halsey made the crucial decision that would define the battle's next phase. Instead of leaving a covering force to guard San Bernardino Strait, he took his entire Third Fleet north in pursuit of Ozawa's carriers. The Japanese bait had been taken completely, leaving the northern approach to Leyte Gulf virtually undefended, just as Admiral Kurita was secretly preparing to reverse course once again and resume his interrupted mission. By sunset on October 24th, the stage was set for the battle's climactic encounters. While Halsey chased phantoms in the north, the separate Japanese forces were approaching Leyte Gulf through the southern and northern straits, converging on the vulnerable American transports and amphibious forces that represented MacArthur's entire Philippine invasion capability. The darkness of October 24th gave way to October 25th with an eerie calm that belied the violence about to erupt in the narrow waters of Surigao Strait. Admiral Shoji Nishimura's southern force to battleships, one heavy cruiser, and for destroyers was steaming northward into what would prove to be a perfectly orchestrated trap. Behind them, Admiral Shima's second group followed at a distance, unaware that they were about to witness the last battleship versus battleship engagement in naval history. At the northern end of the 25-mile-long strait, Admiral Oldendorf had positioned his forces with the precision of a master chess player. 39 PT boats formed the first line of defense, spread across the strait's mouth like a spider's web. Behind them, destroyer squadrons waited in the darkness, their crews at general quarters and torpedo tubes loaded. Finally, crossing the strait's northern exit like a steel barrier, 6 American battleships waited with their main batteries trained southward. The Japanese approach began at 20-30-6 hours when PT Boat 134, commanded by Lieutenant Harley Thronson, spotted the enemy vanguards. Radio reports crackled through the night air as the small craft attempted torpedo attacks against the much larger Japanese vessels. Most of their torpedoes missed, but the psychological effect was significant. Nishimura's force found itself under attack while still miles from its objective, alerting the entire American defensive line to their approach. As the Japanese pressed northward, they ran into increasingly heavy opposition. At 0-3-0-1 hours, Commander Jesse Coward's destroyer Squadron 54 launched a coordinated torpedo attack that devastated the Japanese line. The destroyer Fuso, one of Japan's older battleships, was struck amidships and broke into, her magazines exploding in a pillar of flame that could be seen for miles. 3 Japanese destroyers were also sunk in this single, perfectly executed attack, but Admiral Nishimura, aboard the battleship Yamashiro, refused to turn back despite the mounting losses. With almost suicidal determination, he pressed forward with his remaining ships, believing that his mission to disrupt the American landings justified any sacrifice. At 0-3-50-1 hours, as his battered force finally cleared the strait's northern exit, he found himself facing the concentrated firepower of 6 American battleships, deployed in perfect line formation. The engagement that followed lasted only 18 minutes, but it represented the culmination of decades of battleship development and tactical thinking. The American vessels, guided by the latest radar fire control systems, opened fire at a range of 22,800 yards, nearly 13 miles. With devastating accuracy, the West Virginia, Maryland, and Tennessee, all Pearl Harbor survivors seeking revenge, walked their salvos onto the Yamashiro with mathematical precision. Admiral Nishimura's flagship absorbed hit after hit from 14-inch and 16-inch shells, her superstructure collapsing and her forward turrets knocked out of action. At 0-19 hours, the Yamashiro capsized and sank, taking Nishimura and most of her crew to the bottom. Only one Japanese destroyer escaped the slaughter, limping southward as the sole survivor of the Southern Forces suicide mission. The official U.S. Navy after-action report noted, that this engagement marked the first time in naval history that radar-controlled gunfire had been used in a major fleet action, demonstrating the technological superiority that American industry had achieved by 1944. Admiral Shima's force, arriving an hour later, found only burning wreckage and oil slicks marking the grave of their compatriots. After a brief, confused engagement with American destroyers, Shima wisely chose discretion over valor and withdrew southward. The southern approach to Leyte Gulf had been sealed with overwhelming American victory, achieved at minimal cost. The destroyer Albert W. Grant had been damaged by friendly fire, but no American ships were sunk. As dawn broke over Surigao Strait on October 25th, the wreckage of Japanese ambitions littered the ocean floor. Two battleships, one heavy cruiser, and 3 destroyers had been destroyed in exchange for minor damage to a single American vessel. The age of the battleship as the queen of naval warfare was ending, but it had concluded with one final, decisive demonstration of the devastating power of concentrated naval gunfire. While the thunder of naval gunfire echoed through Surigao Strait, a far more dangerous drama was unfolding to 100 miles to the north. Admiral Kurita's center force, written off as defeated and retreating after the previous day's air attacks, had quietly reversed course during the night and was now threading the needle through San Bernardino Strait. The Japanese admiral's apparent withdrawal had been a masterful deception, luring Halsey's Third Fleet northward and leaving the back door to Leyte Gulf wide open. At 0-6-30 hours on October 25th, Kurita's remaining ships emerged from the strait into the Philippine Sea, like ghosts materializing from morning mist. The force that had looked so formidable 3 days earlier was now a shadow of its former strength. The mighty Musashi rested on the ocean floor. Several heavy cruisers had been sunk or crippled, and many of the surviving vessels bore the scars of relentless air attacks. But at its heart, the super battleship Yamato still represented the most powerful individual warship ever built, supported by 3 other battleships, 6 heavy cruisers, and 11 destroyers. What Kurita discovered as his ships rounded Samur's northeastern cape was beyond his wildest hopes. Instead of the powerful fast battleships and fleet carriers he expected to encounter, he found himself facing a single task unit of 6 escort carriers, 3 destroyers, and for destroyer escorts the entire force displacing less than one of his heavy cruisers. Admiral Clifton Sprague's task unit 7-7.4.3, call sign Taffy 3, represented the only thing standing between the most powerful Japanese surface force of the war and the virtually defenseless transport vessel supporting MacArthur's invasion. The disparity in firepower was almost comical if the situation hadn't been so desperate. Kurita's battleships mounted guns ranging from 14 to 18 inches in caliber, while the largest weapons in Sprague's force were the 5-inch dual-purpose guns on his destroyers. The escort carriers, converted from merchant hulls and designed for anti-submarine warfare, carried no armor protection and could make barely 18 knots at flank speed. In a straight surface engagement, the American force would be annihilated within minutes. But Admiral Sprague had no intention of fighting a conventional battle. Immediately ordering his carriers to launch every available aircraft, regardless of their armament or training, he turned south toward Leyte Gulf while laying smoke screens and calling desperately for help from any American forces within range. His destroyers and destroyer escorts, following the finest traditions of the U.S. Navy, charged directly at the Japanese battleships in an attack so audacious it bordered on the insane. The destroyer Johnston, commanded by Commander Ernest E. Evans, led this David versus Goliath charge with guns blazing. Her 5-inch shells, insignificant against battleship armor, nonetheless scored hits on the heavy cruiser Kumano's bridge, causing confusion in the Japanese formation. More importantly, the Johnston's torpedo attack forced several enemy ships to take evasive action, disrupting their approach and buying precious time for the escort carriers to launch their aircraft. According to historian James Hornfisher's detailed account, in the last stand of the Tinkan sailors, the actions of Taffy 3's destroyers and destroyer escorts represented the most heroic feat of arms in U.S. naval history, surpassing even the legendary charge of the Light Brigade in its combination of desperate courage and tactical impossibility. As the morning wore on, an extraordinary drama unfolded in the waters off Samar. American destroyer crews, knowing they were sacrificing their lives for their shipmates, pressed home attack after attack against vastly superior forces. The destroyer escort Samuel B. Roberts, so small she was nicknamed the destroyer escort that fought like a battleship, engaged Japanese heavy cruisers at point-blank range until her ammunition was exhausted and her hull riddled with shell holes. Meanwhile, pilots from the escort carriers, Many trained only for anti-submarine patrol, flew their aircraft directly into the teeth of the most concentrated anti-aircraft fire in the Pacific. Torpedo planes without torpedoes made dry runs to distract Japanese gunners, while fighters strafed battleship bridges with their 50 caliber machine guns, weapons that couldn't penetrate armor but could kill exposed personnel and disrupt fire control operations. The combination of desperate American resistance and growing Japanese confusion began to tell. Admiral Kurita, expecting to face minimal opposition, found his forces under constant attack from air and surface units that refused to break despite impossible odds. His ships were taking hits, his formation was scattered, and most critically, he was burning fuel and ammunition at an alarming rate with no clear indication of how much additional resistance lay ahead. The battle off Samar had reached its climactic phase as the morning of October 25th wore on, with Admiral Kurita's powerful center force seemingly on the verge of destroying the outgunned American task unit and breaking through to the defenseless transports in Leyte Gulf. The escort carrier Gambier Bay had already been sunk under the concentrated fire of Japanese heavy cruisers, her aircraft fuel and ammunition magazines exploding in towering columns of smoke and flame. The destroyers Johnston and Hull had been battered into sinking wrecks, their crews fighting their guns until the very moment their ships slipped beneath the waves. Yet somehow, impossibly, Admiral Sprague's Taffy 3 continued to fight. The remaining escort carriers Fanshawe Bay, St. Lo, White Plains, and Cullinan Bay kept launching aircraft despite repeated shell hits that should have put them out of action. Their flight decks, designed for the general operations of anti-submarine patrol, became scenes of desperate improvisation as pilots took off with whatever ordnance could be found. Depth charges, rockets intended for ground attack, even bags of metal fragments that can serve as makeshift cluster bombs. The destroyer escort Samuel B. Roberts, having expended her torpedoes and most of her 5-inch ammunition, continued to engage Japanese heavy cruisers at suicidally close range. Her gunners, many of them barely out of their teens, maintained a steady fire that actually forced the cruiser to kind of break off her attack on the carriers. When her forward 5-inch gun mount was knocked out by a direct hit, the surviving crew members continued to serve their remaining weapons until the ship herself began to break apart under repeated shell impacts. But the most extraordinary aspect of the battle off Samar was not the heroism of individual ships and crews, remarkable as that was, but the gradual transformation of Admiral Kurita's tactical situation from apparent victory to growing uncertainty. His ships were indeed sinking American vessels and inflicting heavy casualties, but they were paying an increasingly heavy price for their success. The constant air attacks, however improvised and desperate, were causing significant damage to his force. The heavy cruiser Shizuya had been knocked out of action by repeated bomb hits, forcing her to retire with heavy casualties and flooding. The Chikai, flagship of the cruiser division, had taken torpedo damage that reduced her speed and effectiveness. Even the mighty Yamato had been forced to turn away temporarily when American aircraft concentrated their attacks on her massive hull, demonstrating that no ship, regardless of size or armor, was immune to sustained air assault. Contemporary Japanese naval records, later translated by U.S. Navy historians, revealed that Admiral Kurita became increasingly concerned about his fuel consumption and ammunition expenditure. As the battle progressed, factors that would prove crucial to his subsequent decision-making. More significantly, Admiral Kurita was fighting blind. His reconnaissance aircraft had been shot down or driven off, leaving him with no clear picture of what American forces might be waiting beyond the horizon. For all he knew, Halsey's powerful Third Fleet was already racing south to trap his weakened force against the Philippine coast. The element of surprise, so crucial to Operation Shogo One's success, had been completely lost, and every minute of delay increased the likelihood of facing overwhelming American reinforcements. As the engagement entered its third hour, American reinforcements were indeed arriving, though not in the form Kurita expected. Admiral Thomas Sprague's Taffy 2, another escort carrier group, operating to the south, had launched every available aircraft to support their embattled colleagues. These planes, joined by land-based aircraft from newly captured airfields in Leyte, began to arrive over the battle area in increasing numbers. The psychological effect on the Japanese crews was profound. Having expected to face minimal resistance, they found themselves engaged in the most intense surface action many had ever experienced. Under constant air attack, with no clear indication of when relief might arrive, ships that had survived 3 years of Pacific combat were being pushed to their operational limits by an enemy force that should have been annihilated within the first hour of battle. at 0-9-20-3 hours. With victory seemingly within his grasp and the surviving American carriers fleeing southward, Admiral Kurita made the decision that would haunt Japanese naval historians for generations. Instead of pressing his attack home against the now scattered escort carriers, he ordered his force to break off the engagement and retire northward. The most powerful Japanese surface force of the war, having achieved tactical surprise and numerical superiority, abandoned the field just as the greatest victory in modern naval history lay within reach. The reasons for Kurita's withdrawal remain debated to this day, but the immediate result was clear. The miracle of Samar had saved MacArthur's Philippine invasion and preserved the lives of thousands of American soldiers and sailors who would have been helpless targets for Japanese naval gunfire. Admiral Halsey's Third Fleet was pounding northward through heavy seas. On the morning of October 25th, chasing Admiral Ozawa's northern force with the single-minded determination of a hunting pack pursuing wounded prey, the four Japanese carriers Zuikaku, Zuiho, Chitos, and Chiyoda represented the last remnants of the once mighty Kido Butai that had struck Pearl Harbor nearly 3 years earlier. For Halsey, their destruction would mark the symbolic end of Japanese naval aviation and complete America's dominance over the Pacific. But even as his dive bombers and torpedo planes prepared to launch the attacks that would finish the Japanese carrier force, urgent messages were flooding the Third Fleet's radio circuits from the south. Admiral Sprague's desperate calls for help from off Samar had finally reached Halsey's flagship, revealing that the supposedly defeated center force had achieved complete surprise and was on the verge of destroying the Seventh Fleet's escort carriers. The realization that he had been completely deceived by Japanese strategy filled the American admiral with a rage that his staff would remember for years afterward. The first airstrikes against Ozawa's carriers achieved everything Halsey had hoped for and more. The Chitos was sunk quickly under concentrated attack, her flight deck erupting in flames as aviation gasoline ignited throughout her hangar spaces. The Chiyoda followed within hours, victim of the same devastating combination of bombs and torpedoes that had destroyed her sister ship. These vessels, converted from seaplane tenders, lacked the armor protection of purpose-built carriers and proved vulnerable to even modest attacks by experienced American aircrews. But the prize Halsey truly sought was the Zuikaku, last survivor of the Pearl Harbor attack force and now serving as Admiral Ozawa's flagship. This fleet carrier, veteran of every major Pacific engagement from the Coral Sea to the Philippine Sea, represented the heart and soul of Japanese naval aviation. Her destruction would complete a circle of vengeance that began in the burning wreckage of Battleship Row on December 7, 1941. The attacks on Zuikaku required multiple strikes to achieve their objective, as her experienced damage control crews fought desperately to save their ship. By afternoon, however, the accumulated damage had become overwhelming. Hit by numerous bombs and at least 4 torpedoes, the great carrier began to list heavily to port as her watertight compartments flooded one by one. At 14:14 hours, she capsized and sank, taking with her the last operational remnant of the force that had once terrorized the Pacific. Admiral Ozawa's final message to Combined Fleet Headquarters, transmitted just before abandoning his flagship, reportedly read, "The Northern Force has accomplished its mission. The enemy has taken the bait." Yet even as Halsey achieved his tactical victory in the north, the strategic situation was deteriorating rapidly in the south. The increasingly frantic messages from Taffy 3 revealed that Admiral Kurita's surprise attack had caught the Seventh Fleet completely unprepared. Admiral Kincaid's urgent appeals for immediate assistance finally broke through Halsey's focus on the carrier battle, forcing him to confront the possibility that his pursuit of the Northern Force had left the entire Philippine invasion exposed to catastrophic defeat. The decision to detach Admiral Willis Lee's Task Force 34 fast battleships and their escorts for an emergency run south came almost too late to matter. By the time these powerful ships could reach the Samar area, the crisis would be long over. One way or another, Halsey's gamble in taking his entire force north had succeeded in destroying the last Japanese carriers, but at the potential cost of the entire Philippine campaign. As October 25th drew to a close, the various elements of the Battle of Leyte Gulf reached their resolution almost simultaneously. Admiral Kurita's withdrawal from Samar saved the American invasion force, but also marked the end of the Imperial Navy's last realistic chance to achieve a major strategic victory. Admiral Ozawa's northern force had achieved its mission of luring Halsey away from the main battle area, but at the cost of Japan's remaining carrier aviation capability. The final casualty count revealed the true magnitude of what had transpired in the waters around the Philippines. The Japanese Navy had lost for aircraft carriers 3 battleships, 10 cruisers, and 11 destroyers, effectively ending its ability to conduct major fleet operations. For the remainder of the war, American losses, while significant in human terms, were strategically insignificant, to escort carriers, to destroyers, and 1 destroyer escort. Most importantly, MacArthur's invasion of Leyte continued uninterrupted, establishing the foothold that would eventually lead to the liberation of the entire Philippine archipelago. The Battle of Leyte Gulf had indeed been the largest naval engagement in history, involving over 200 ships and determining the course of the Pacific War's final phase. When the smoke cleared and the casualty reports were tallied, it was clear that American industrial might and tactical innovation had achieved a victory so complete that Japan's naval power would never again threaten Allied operations in the Pacific.